The moment he kissed her, the bond shattered. He wasn't supposed to love her, not the vampire bride offered to him by blood and war. His soul had already been tied, etched into another's since childhood. But hearts don't ask permission, and fate doesn't keep its promises. He was bonded to one, married to another, and in love with both. Now the ancient pact between wolves and vampires is cracking. Every beat of his heart risks tearing the world apart. If he lets go of his bondmate, the treaty will burn. If he stays loyal, he loses the one thing he never thought he could have, a love that chose him back. And the worst part, he doesn't know which betrayal will destroy him first. The rain fell like ash, cold and clinging, as the bells of Bloodhold rang. Orion stood at the altar of stone and bone, his hands steady, but his soul screaming. The vampire princess before him wore crimson silk and a crown of thorns. She was breathtaking, untouchable. Behind his eyes, 1,000 memories of Riva flashed. Moonlit runs, shared howls, fingers twined under ancient trees. But now, none of that mattered. The binding words were being spoken. The pact was being sealed. His silence was part of the price for peace, and love, as always, was the first thing to be sacrificed. Riva watched from the high terrace, surrounded by wolves she no longer trusted. The soul mark on her chest pulsed dully, still intact, but dimming, as if mourning in real time. She had known this would happen, trained for it, prepared herself to be left behind, but nothing could have readied her for the way his eyes refused to meet hers as he kissed his bride. There was no hate in her, only a vast, hollow ache that swallowed the last of her breath. She left before the applause began, disappearing into shadow like a ghost that no one dared to name. Myron stood still as the binding thread was tied around their wrists, silver and black, symbol of alliance and survival. She had not wanted this. She had fought it with the quiet stubbornness of someone long used to losing battles. But now, with the entire vampire court watching, she played the role she was born for. She didn't look at Orion, but she felt him, torn, hard, alive, and for a single breath she pitied him. Then the pity died, and in its place rose something colder. Resolve. The kiss was brief, symbolic. No fire, no spark, just skin against skin and a shared inhale of obligation. The moment it ended, the bond flared between them, not magic but something stranger, possibility. It shocked them both, and then it vanished. The silence between them said everything they couldn't, and somewhere far beneath the mountain, the ancient spirits stirred. Later that night, as the palace settled into forced celebration, Orion stood alone by the obsidian window, watching the lightning crawl across the sky. His soul mark still burned faintly for Riva. But a new mark, a second thread, thinner but warmer, had begun to form. He didn't know what it meant, he didn't know if it was betrayal. But for the first time since the bond, he felt unsure. The morning after the wedding felt like a battlefield. Orion sat in the council chamber, surrounded by nobles of two species who only smiled with their teeth. Treaties were recited, boundaries drawn, blood debts erased in ink, not forgiveness. Every time he tried to speak, someone else finished the sentence for him. He was a figurehead now, a breathing, bleeding piece in a game played long before he was born. But his thoughts remained in the grove, with her, with Riva. And the ache that came with that name was sharper than any silver blade. Mirren remained distant, walking the corridors of the vampire wing like a stranger in her own skin. She had learned to mask her emotions from the age of 5, had been taught to endure, survive, outlast. But something about the wedding, the man, the moment, left her unsettled. Not because she wanted him, but because for a heartbeat she thought he saw her. And that was more dangerous than desire, because it was real, and real things had a cost. Riva ran through the snow-drenched woods, her breath fogging the air, her limbs trembling from rage and grief. She found the ruins of the Moonstone Circle, the sacred place where their bond was first sealed. Her claws dug into the dirt. She wanted to hate him, but she couldn't. The bond didn't allow for clean severance. It lingered, ghosted her skin, called her back. She howled, not for help, but to remember who she was before all of this. Before him. That night, as Orion tried to sleep beside a stranger-turned wife, his body tensed at every sound. Mirren did not touch him, did not speak. But she lay awake, her thoughts bleeding through the walls of her mind. They both were pretending to be whole, both waiting for the other to break first. Between them, silence stretched like a wound. The bond flared again at midnight, unexpected and sharp. Orion gasped as if someone had struck him in the chest. Mirren turned toward him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. She had felt it too. Something passed between them, an echo of pain, a spark of connection. It wasn't supposed to be possible, and yet it was there. The relic was older than language, black stone veined with living silver. It pulsed when Riva touched it, like it recognized her grief. The moonkeeper who once tended this grove had spoken of it only in riddles. That which binds can also sever, but never cleanly. She wrapped the stone in cloth and left before the moon rose. Something inside her had shifted. She was done waiting, done grieving. It was time to choose her own ending. In the palace, Mirren confronted a vampire elder who had once mentored her mother. His words were poison wrapped in silk. Do not grow attached. This union is symbolic, nothing more. But she had already broken that rule. There was a tremor inside her when she looked at Orion now. Not love, not yet, but recognition, and something older than both of them. Something neither court had planned for. Orion trained in the combat yard until his fists bled. Every movement was too fast, too sharp, his wolf instincts off balance. His packmates whispered that he was losing himself. He knew the truth. He was changing. He felt everything too deeply now. When Mirren entered the courtyard to observe, his pulse flared. When she spoke his name, the mark on his chest responded. The bond was no longer passive. It was hungry. That night, Riva lit a fire beneath the whispering stones and called upon the spirit of her grandmother, the one who had once severed her own bond to a vampire prince. The spirit came, cold, broken, furious. If you break the bond, you will never be whole again, but you will be free. And for the first time, Riva didn't flinch. Meanwhile, Mirren found herself dreaming in another's voice, memories that weren't hers, a grove she had never entered, a wolf's name whispered like a curse. When she awoke, she asked Orion a single question. Who is Riva to you? He didn't answer. The moon feast was meant to celebrate the alliance. Instead, it became a theater of tension wrapped in silk and secrets. Orion wore his ceremonial wolf fur cloak, but it felt too tight against his skin, as if the fabric rejected him. Mirren entered last, regal in a gown of black opal thread, eyes unreadable. Every noble in the room watched them like a myth waiting to collapse. When the music began, no one moved, until Mirren extended her hand, not out of affection, but defiance. They danced in silence. No rhythm but breath, no choreography but instinct. Her fingers were cool against his palm, but his body flared hot at her touch. Every step was a message neither could say aloud. He led. She resisted. Then she led. He surrendered. Somewhere in the middle, resistance dissolved. In the corner of the ballroom, a glass shattered. No one noticed. They were watching the war take shape on the dance floor. Riva arrived at the feast uninvited, cloaked in shadows, her hair unbound. She stood in the archway, watching them move like lovers in denial. Her breath caught when Orion's hand slid to Mirren's back. It wasn't desire that struck her, it was realization. She was no longer part of the equation. The pain wasn't sharp. It was dull, distant, like something already dead, decaying slowly inside her. After the dance, Orion retreated to the stone balcony, lungs heaving as if he'd run 100 miles. Mirren followed, silent for a time. Then she said, "You looked at me, like I was the only one in the room." He didn't deny it. Couldn't. She stepped closer. He flinched, not away but toward. "Is that betrayal?" she asked, and he answered, "I don't know anymore." In the forest that night, Riva lit a fire made of cursed birch and spoke the name of the relic aloud. The wind died, the trees leaned in, and the bond inside her began to shift, bend, not toward Orion, but away. The pain was immense, blinding, but so was the clarity. Maybe she didn't need to be claimed. Maybe being unbound wasn't loss, but rebirth. The soul mark burned like molten iron across Orion's chest just before dawn. He gasped awake, clutching at his skin, sweat pouring from his body like he'd been pulled from a river of fire. He stumbled to the mirror, and there it was, a new thread emerging, thin and red, pulsing with life. It connected him not just to Mirren, but somewhere deeper. A third signature. Riva, fading, flaring, fighting. Mirren rushed into his room seconds later, her eyes wide, her hand on her own collarbone. She'd felt it too, the pulse, the fire, the tearing. "She's doing it," she whispered. "She's breaking the bond." Orion stared at her, his voice dry as ash. "But it's not breaking, it's pulling us all together." For the first time, she looked at him with something more than caution. She looked at him with fear. Riva collapsed by the moonstone circle, the relic still burning against her palm. The spirits had warned her this would happen. To unbind something ancient meant it would fight to remain whole. Her veins burned, her vision blurred, but she saw them both. Orion, standing shirtless in the mirror, Mirren beside him, glowing faintly. And she saw herself. Outside that image, outside everything, the magic surged. One mark began to split, but instead of severing, it doubled. 3 points, one bond, no blueprint, no prophecy, just connection and chaos. The spirit screamed in her mind, but Riva laughed, low and bitter. "If I can't have him," she whispered, "then let's see if the world can survive all three of us." Later that day, Orion stood in the Hall of Stone, surrounded by both courts, asked to explain the mark glowing on his skin. He lied, said it was a wound, said nothing had changed, but in his soul he knew the truth. This wasn't just a love triangle. It was a soul web, one never meant to exist, one that could collapse or evolve into something the world had never seen. The triad bond wasn't meant to exist. That became clear when the winds over Bloodhold began to turn inward, swirling around the castle like a great inhale that never exhaled. Magic had rules, old ones carved into stone and bone, and what Orion, Mirren and Riva had created was an offense to those laws. The very air began to hum unnaturally. Moonlight refused to touch the grove. Animals changed their migration. The world was reacting, but no one yet understood how. Orion could barely sleep. The bond kept him awake, thrumming in his blood like music that changed key every few hours. Sometimes he felt Riva's heartbeat, sometimes Mirren's breath in the back of his throat, sometimes, worse, he felt them feeling each other. It wasn't just emotional anymore, it was intimate, it was layered, and it was dangerously addictive. Mirren withdrew into her wing of the castle, surrounded by arcane tomes and relics her ancestors had hidden away. She found one reference to something similar, a failed triad bond from centuries ago, erased from records after 2 of the souls went mad, and the third vanished into stone. She didn't tell Orion. She didn't want to scare him. But in the mirror, she traced the new mark blooming over her collarbone and whispered, "Please, let this be different." Riva, far from the palace, now heard voices in her dreams. They weren't from the spirit anymore. They were Orion's, Mirren's, hers. merging and twisting, forming sentences that had never been spoken, thoughts that belonged to all of them. She stood in the ruins of a forgotten wolf altar and watched the wind bend toward her, heard the trees lean in. "You are no longer one," they said. "You are bound in threes." The old magic must answer. When the council noticed the magical imbalance, they summoned Orion. He stood before wolves and vampires alike, accused of instability, of violating sacred thresholds. He said nothing, because there was no way to explain it, not yet, not without invoking panic. But in the crowd someone else was watching. Riva returned, changed, and glowing with power not her own. She entered the hall of the pact like a storm wearing skin. Riva, no longer a simple beta wolf, but something radiant and strange. Her eyes shimmered with silver-veined amber. Her heartbeat thudded through the floor like a second pulse. No one recognized her, not truly, except Orion and Myron. They both stood at once when she appeared, neither sure if they were afraid or relieved. Orion didn't speak. He couldn't. Every muscle in his body locked at the sight of her. Riva stared at him for a long time, then let her gaze fall to Myron. For a breath, the three of them simply existed, silent, still, pulled taut by a force stronger than memory. Then Riva said, "I didn't come back to reclaim what's mine. I came to understand what we've become." And in that moment, the bond flared between them, not as a chain, as a circle. Myron stepped forward, hesitant. She wanted to hate Riva, wanted to mark territory like a cornered queen. But the truth was colder. She didn't feel threatened. She felt known, like Riva already understood the parts of Orion that Myron hadn't touched yet. And instead of jealousy, she felt curiosity. And that was even more dangerous. That night they met in secret, just the three of them, in the lower chamber beneath the moonstone tree. The bond was thick in the air like incense. Myron lit candles, Orion poured wine. Riva stood with her back to the flame, speaking first. "This thing between us, it's not love. Not yet, but it could be." And no one disagreed. When they touched hands, fingertips only, the mark on Orion's chest bloomed into full color, red, silver, black, the soul web completed. The spirits howled in the deep woods. Something ancient had been accepted, something dangerous had been invited. The prophecy came in fragments, scratched into bark, echoed in birdsong, dreamed during half-sleeps. 3 souls cannot stand unless one kneels. One heart must bleed. One must become wind. It made no sense at first, until the fever dreams began. Orion saw himself walking through a forest made of mirrors. Each reflection showed him holding only one of them. In each dream, someone else turned to ash. Myron tried to find answers in the archives, old scrolls in vampire dialects long dead, stories of triads, always tragic. One where a witch set fire to herself so the other 2 could love. Another where the bond turned toxic and all 3 became beasts. None ended with peace. None ended with choice. Myron began to fear that love was not their salvation. It was their test. Riva refused to believe fate could trap them. She sought out the Moonkeeper, the last surviving priest of the wolf bloodline. He told her the truth. The magic was never made for 3. But the world is changing. If you hold each other, truly hold, the bond might rewrite itself. The key wasn't blood. It was intention. The only way forward was through full emotional surrender, and that terrified her more than war. Meanwhile, tension in the courts grew. Nobles whispered. Wolves questioned their alpha. Vampires demanded Myron's loyalty. The bond was becoming public knowledge. Unnatural, blasphemous, a threat to lineage, legacy, law. Rumors of assassination spread like frost. The triad would have to choose soon, step into light, or be hunted in shadow. When Orion, Myron, and Riva returned to the tree together, this time they didn't flinch. They spoke the words aloud, claimed the bond, declared it. and the forest listened. Roots trembled, stars bent, and somewhere deep underground, a locked gate began to creak open. The gate beneath the moonstone tree had no hinges, no carvings, just a smooth, seamless wall of stone. But when the triad placed their hands upon it, the rock rippled like water, revealing symbols none of them had ever seen. Wolf, vampire, and a third glyph, neither both. A forgotten lineage, a sign that what they had created wasn't new, it was simply returned. Inside the gate was a memory, not a room, not a place, a living memory suspended in amber light. They walked through a forest of flame where no fire burned. Faces from the past watched them with eyes full of longing. A woman with 2 soul marks, a man made of mist, a third shadowed, voiceless, all 3 crying without sound. The memory spoke. "We failed. You may not." Orion stepped forward. "What do we do?" he asked. The memory answered with silence, then showed them a tree cracking in 2. One half grew flowers, the other bled. A lesson in choice, in cost. Then they were expelled, breathless, marked with golden dust across their shoulders. The bond had passed the first threshold, but the final one would demand more. Above ground, the courts declared them abominations. The sole tribunal of Verea issued an ultimatum: separate the bond or face annihilation. It would be blood or obedience. The triad had 3 days to comply. Riva spit on the message. Mirren burned it. Orion whispered, "Then we prepare for war." But the bond had already begun shifting again. Riva's mark was paling, Mirren's was glowing, and Orion felt hollow. The soul web was straining. Harmony had birthed imbalance. Love had created danger. War came not with horns, but with silence. The triad refused to separate, and in doing so declared war on centuries of tradition. The vampire high houses unleashed their blood guard. The wolf clans broke ancient neutrality. Firestorms rolled across the fields between kingdoms. Entire forests fell. Cities turned to bone and ash, and in the center of it all stood 3 souls, holding each other. Riva led the defense of the northern border, wielding new magic like claws made of lightning. Mirren descended upon the skyfields with her blood flame, silent, elegant, deadly. Orion rode between factions, a blur of command and fury, voice booming across fields soaked in magic. They did not hide anymore. They fought, for each other, for the future. For a bond no one else could understand. But even as they fought as one, they unraveled. Orion's dreams began to splinter. He saw 2 futures, one with Riva, one with Mirren, and in both, someone died. The gate's prophecy circled closer now, whispers in the wind, faces in fire. One must fall for the bond to live. They met again beneath the moonstone tree, bloodied, trembling. Mirren said it first. "It's me. I'll go." Riva shouted no. Orion dropped to his knees. And the tree, ancient and silent, opened once more, but this time it did not show a memory. It demanded a choice. And as the light poured from the gate, the triad stood together, knowing that only 2 would walk back out. The gate opened like a breath held for centuries, exhaling ancient magic into the roots of the world. It wasn't light that spilled forth. It was memory, grief, echoes of choices never made. Orion, Mirren, and Riva stepped forward together, though their bodies trembled. The space inside the gate was not a chamber. It was a living threshold where time fractured and willpower took form. At its center stood a pedestal of obsidian, etched with the triad symbol, each point pulsing with life, waiting for one to dim. They were not alone. Figures emerged from the mist, shadows of past bonds, lovers, warriors, leaders who had tried what they now embodied. One triad had turned on itself, each killing the other. Another had ended in eternal sleep, neither choosing or perishing. The last had become something more. It had transcended, but only after one gave everything. A bond with 3 roots cannot bloom unless one becomes soil. The spirit's voices were like wind inside bone, cold, final. Riva stepped forward first, her chest heaving, arms trembling. She had always been the fighter, the protector, the one to charge first and break last. "I'll be the one," she said, voice rough but steady. This was never supposed to be mine anyway. But Mirren grabbed her arm, eyes shining. "No, I've taken too much already. Let me give something back." They turned to Orion, who was weeping, not from fear, but from certainty. There has to be another way. But the pedestal didn't move. The gate did not bend. The spirits answered with silence, and the pedestal glowed brighter. The bond was destabilizing. Orion could feel it inside his ribcage, like bones grinding against themselves. If no one chose, all 3 would be lost. The magic would feed on itself. They had minutes, maybe seconds. Mirren looked at him, and in that moment, he saw every moment they'd shared, every glance, every quiet breath, every time she didn't speak because she knew words would hurt more. Riva placed her hand over his heart. "Orion, you don't have to carry us both. Let one of us carry you for once." But Mirren moved too. "No, he needs her strength. And my silence." The mark on Orion's chest split, one half pulsing gold, the other darkening to ash. He screamed. The bond was choosing, and it wouldn't be gentle. One mark would survive, the other would turn to dust, and one soul would vanish from the circle. In the end, it was not logic or duty or prophecy that decided. It was love. Quiet, bare, brutal love. Mirren stepped forward, her face calm, her body already fading at the edges as the pedestal drew in her magic like a tide. "Let it be me," she said softly. "Let me be the root beneath the bloom, the fire beneath the blood. You'll carry me in every part of the bond. That will be enough." Orion reached for her, but her body was already fading like moonlight in dawn. Riva collapsed, sobbing, not from victory, but from loss. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't a contest. She didn't want this. Not this way. She crawled toward Mirren, clutching her hand as it began to cool. "We could have found another path. We always do." Mirren smiled, and even as her soul began to unravel, she said, "Then walk it for me." She looked at Orion. "Both of you. Live like I believed you could." Then the pedestal pulsed, and Mirren was gone. There was no explosion. No scream, just quiet. The bond constricted, then flexed, and suddenly Orion and Riva could feel her not as presence but as pressure. She was gone, and yet not. The soul mark remained, burned into both of them, a memory woven into flesh. But her voice, her breath, her warmth was no longer reachable, only echoes. The gate closed slowly, as if mourning the sacrifice. The light dimmed. The tree outside bloomed violently, petals of red and white and silver scattering into the wind. The forest stilled. The bond had stabilized, but at a cost none of them would ever forget. And in that stillness, the first tears Orion had ever wept since childhood finally fell. They left the gate different. 2 where there had been 3. One memory brighter than pain. One silence louder than war. Riva took his hand without speaking. She didn't have words, and neither did he. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, only that she had given them one. The war ended not with treaties, but with exhaustion. When word spread that Mirren of House Virea had sacrificed her life to protect both races, the courts fell silent. No one claimed victory. No one threw celebration. There was only mourning, and something quieter beneath it. Reverence, because for the first time in centuries, a vampire had died not for power, but for peace. Riva was named High Warden of the Borderlands, the first of her kind to be recognized by both vampire and wolf alike. She did not want the title, but she accepted it. For Mirren, Orion became a bridge, not a ruler, not a king, but a living bond. He traveled from court to clan, whispering stories, protecting the frail flame of unity. They didn't need thrones, they needed memory. The moonstone tree bore new fruit, silver pears said to grant visions. The wind in the grove carried 3 harmonies now, not 2. Sometimes, when Riva stood beneath its boughs, she heard Mirren's laughter in the rustling of leaves. Orion never returned to the gate. He feared what might be waiting, but the mark on his chest glowed warmly whenever the wind shifted east. Children were told the story in whispers, not as prophecy, not as history, but as truth. 3 souls, 1 bond. A love that rewrote the laws of the world. Some believed it, others didn't, but none dared to question the blooming of peace that followed, and none, ever again, saw the bond as a curse. In private moments, Orion would still speak to her, not aloud, not in prayer, just inside, the way she'd once said she could feel him breathe across a room, and sometimes, for a single heartbeat, he thought he heard her answer. Seasons passed. Wolves howled under gentler moons. Vampires sang laments rather than war songs, but the bond between Orion and Riva remained restless, not broken, but incomplete. Her presence lingered like fire after embers, never dying, never growing. They spoke of her like a sacred ghost, but in truth, neither of them could move forward. They were living with half a heartbeat. Then, on the 13th full moon since the gate closed, the tree began to weep. Not sap, not blood, but pure light. It spilled from a single bloom high above the grove, and where it touched the ground, grass turned silver. The bond on Orion's chest flared violently. Riva's did too, and they both felt something unmistakable. She was calling. The priests declared it an anomaly. The council feared it was a curse, but Orion knew Mirren was not gone. She was changing, evolving, becoming something the world had never seen, not spirit, not memory. Something between, a soul too vast to vanish, a flame too fierce to die. They returned to the tree together, hands clasped, breath shared, and beneath that blooming canopy they felt her again, like a sigh in the wind, a thought on the verge of speech, not enough to hold, but enough to know. And they wept, not because she was lost, but because she wasn't entirely. The bond was no longer triad in shape. It had become something larger, a web that spanned realms, flesh, magic, memory. Mirren had not died. She had transcended. And with her the future opened, unwritten, unbound, luminous. Years later a child is born beneath the moonstone tree, not to Orion, not to Riva, but to a union between vampire and wolf, something once thought impossible. The child bears no soul mark, but her eyes are mirrored silver and red. Her laughter echoes like 3 voices in one. The priests call her the heir of harmony. The people simply call her hope. Orion and Riva watch from the edge of the grove, older, slower, but not weary. The world is different now, not perfect but possible. Treaties hold because stories do. Bloodshed has given way to ritual, and vengeance has been replaced by memory. The child runs among the roots, her fingers tracing the tree, as if she remembers something no one taught her. At night, Orion sits beneath the stars and whispers stories, of a bond that burned and bloomed, of a woman made of fire and silence, of choices that changed the sky. Riva listens, adds her own verses. Sometimes the wind joins in, and when it does, they know she's listening. The mark on Orion's chest still glows. So does Riva's, but now it pulses not with pain or confusion, but with gratitude. It is not a reminder of loss. It is a seal of legacy. Proof that some stories don't have to end to matter. Some souls don't need bodies to burn. They do not fear what comes next, because they have lived what no one dared to believe, a love that shattered law and outlived death. And when they are gone, the tree will remain, the bond will remain, the story will remain. And somewhere, in the wind, a voice will whisper, "Love doesn't break, it becomes." They planted a new stone at the edge of the moonstone tree. It was small, smooth, unmarked, not meant to be worshipped, only remembered. The kind of stone one might sit beside in silence, not to mourn, but to listen. The wind still moved strangely through those branches, sometimes fast, sometimes still, and always, always warm. Years had passed, decades even. Orion's fur had faded at the edges. Riva's voice had grown deeper, quieter, but the fire inside them, hers, never went out. They no longer called it a soul bond. That word was too small. It was simply her. In the way the leaves shook without wind, in the way silver light pooled across the grass at dusk, in the way they still reached for each other, not out of need, but out of knowing. Children came to the tree every year to hear the story, not as myth, as memory, of the wolf who chose silence, of the vampire who chose sacrifice, of the bond that bent the world but didn't break. Orion told it without sadness. Riva added the details. The child named Hope listened hardest, her hands always pressed to the bark, as if waiting to be held back, and maybe, sometimes, she was. Because sometimes in the middle of a summer night, when the grove was lit only by starlight, the tree would sigh. A pulse of warmth would pass through the roots. The marks on Orion and Riva would flicker once more, and far away, in a place that was not quite life and not quite death, a presence would stir, not gone, not ghost, still burning.